Dag the Eve Agus Fáilte. Hi, hello and welcome. It is Jon O'Sullivan from the Irish Pagan School, and we are here with another weekly coffee chat check-in. And today it's a community question, actually, which is quite fascinating. I'm looking forward to wrangling with it a little bit. So with coffee in hand and on board, the first thing we need to do, as usual, is to remind you that there is a free resource available for you down in the descriptions, in the links below on this, where you're in the YouTubes, the Patreon, or on the podcast. It's a free resource that tells you what good resources are. It also gets you onto our mailing list, which keeps you connected and up to date with all of the amazing and awesome stuff that is going on with myself and Laura at the Irish Pagan School, as well as the monthly invites for the social sessions we host and hang out in. So do make sure you pop down and pick that up, because it can really help kind of answer a lot of questions as early as possible, or even kind of challenge some like biases or perceptions. We do still get people emailing us like, well, why isn't this book on your good resources list? And invariably we do our best to kind of point out either it's the content because of how it's presented, or because of its appropriative history or elements of that. But then also it might be the creator, it might be the individual who is problematic in certain ways for certain communities, or our community. And we feel that we can't really devoid the artist from the art to some degree. So there does need to be an awareness of the energetic impact that goes along with this. So even though you might not agree with someone's practices, beliefs, histories, legal status, or something like that, or terrible things, if you still buy their content, invest in their, you're directing energy in the form of your finances or your attention towards them in that way. So yeah, it's something that we try and be very open and upfront about, and also apply to ourselves. If you feel that we are not the kind of people that provide good quality resources, or we're not the kind of people that you can kind of stand beside of or ask good questions from, or if there's anything about us, then do absolutely go elsewhere. We don't want to be demanding anyone's energy or attention in any way, shape, or form if they believe we're in some way not safe individuals for any community at all. We'll disagree with them, ardently disagree with them, but also we won't just disagree with them from a point of belligerence. We'll actually self-check, self-assess, and question, is there some validity? And we have had people raise flags with us about members of our communities, and we have taken the necessary steps when we can show that they are unsafe individuals and need to be removed. So we pride ourselves on doing that as best we can. So I said I had a community question for you, and this one came in, interestingly enough, on a story I wrote many years ago, but then did a recent video recording of. And so it was a story about the seventh day, and it's about the Tuatha Dé Danann, the gods of the Tuatha Dé Danann, centered particularly around the market and the Dagda and their interactions, when I was still trying to figure this out as an early Irish pagan on my own path. Of course, reading over the story again, there's many things I'm like, well, now I know better. But then also there's some kind of core elements of the character. It's like, shit, I fucking nailed that, even before I really knew or understood. So the question that we have, it comes in from our kind of YouTube comments there, because thank you very much for those who do connect and engage and interact with our content. This one was wondering, did the ancient Irish revere their ancestors as some cultures like the Japanese do? So it's a very, very fascinating, very, very interesting question. What I will do first is that, though I find the Japanese culture absolutely fascinating myself, and I do love exploring it, I am not of that culture. I am in no way, no way really able to speak in any informed manner about that other culture. So that's why I will steer as clear from that as I can. But if you think that there is content out there, or if you are a member of the Japanese culture and you have an opinion on this, do make sure you're popping into the comments and letting us know, because I do find that fascinating as well. But when we kind of steer to this idea of revering their ancestors from the ancient Irish perspective, it's a bit of a tricky one to quantify. So when the colonization of Ireland happened by the Catholic Church, because that's what it was, there was like multiple missionaries to Ireland, There was a lot of stuff that was deemed apocryphal or deemed kind of not withholding or not in keeping with the proper one true religion that really should be in place. And so we did lose a lot of information. We 100% lost a lot of content and a lot of information about like practices. Like, ancient Ireland was an oral society. Like the only writing was Om, and the Om was carved for formal occasions, really, on like kind of stones or boundary markers, or we know from archaeological speaking that there were wood henges in places, so it's possible that they may have had Om upon them as well. But the Om script is not exactly conducive to writing down full stories, full theses, full kind of rituals, practices, anything like that at all. The ancient Irish society was an oral-based society, and we know this very clearly because there were members of very specific castes within the structure as recognized by the law tracts of that time, whose purpose was to function as memory, to function as repositories of knowledge, of stories, of information. And those were in a number of different ways, either brehons for the judgments and providing judgment, the druids for natural philosophy and the natural sciences, and then of course the bards, and the upper levels of the bards being Fila, and also the upper levels of all of them being Olive. By the way, in order to become a Fila, you had to be very, very fucking top end, good at your job. In order to be Olive, you have to be very, very fucking top end of your job for 20 years. You don't just get to turn around and be like, well, I like the word Olive. Like, Olive is a professor. Olive, like, if you want to contextualize it in our modern circumstances, it is a professor who has tenure, who is like one of those people who is an institution within an academic society because of the decades of effort and work and bodies of information they have brought and dedicated to their field. So it's a big deal to be getting that. And if we were to look at Jon's, I don't know, pagan career path, maybe it's bard. That's why I refer to myself as a bard. I'm not in any way Fila. There is only one person in Ireland that I consider a Fila, and that is Geraldine Merkins Byrne, who teaches amazing classes in our school, and Drioch Ceol being a really fascinating one about the magic in music. But the magic in music, I said it right. But there's very few people I would consider Olive from a spiritual point of view at all in Ireland. But I am segueing slightly. So when we look at the culture and the old culture, we know that things were maintained by oral tradition in an oral standard. And that noise, people, is me just destroying my coffee mug. I have John handsed the coffee mug and it has cracked. So there we go. Stories of interesting times. So we know that there was a lot of information that was maintained purely in this oral structure. And that means that if the information was not passed on, it's lost. And so a lot of individuals who may have had kind of closed practices, a lot of like druidic behaviors, like rituals, would not have been written down. They would have been performed and educated and handed down to people who are learning and growing in that caste of society. But of course, when missionary work arrives and all native knowledge, all indigenous practices is deemed to be barbaric or corrupt or terrible in some way, shape, or form, or antithesis to proper divinity, suddenly it's all kind of vilified. And next thing we know, we have, well, actually, no, we can clearly see there's facets of like, penal laws, for example, which are put in place upon Ireland, which made it illegal for Irish nobles to house a bard. Not even a druid, not even like a brehon or a judge, a bard, a storyteller, an Irish storyteller, because the Irish storytellers, those bards, knew all of the old stories of empowered Irish people, empowered Irish culture. And so that's where we have, you're probably feeling me on this, like there's so much lost information that we know we have lost and we may never recover. And so I get very, very frustrated by that. Rip mug handle in this instance. I'm the kind of guy who is annoyed about the burning of the Library of Alexandria. Like that, the ancient wonders of the world, this fascinating library of information. I've said it before, I will say it again, but the same feeling applies to ancient Irish lore because we know there is so much that was lost. But what we do have made it out of the oral traditions into written manuscript form. And that is something that we are very, very lucky and very, very grateful to have, given what was done to Irish society and the Irish people. And as much as people, like some individuals out there, some pagans out there, are like, well, it was written down by Christians, so you have to ignore it anyway. That's not so. It was written down by Irish people, who were very clear about their bias. And in many cases, you can see it in the documents. There's these things called marginalia in books like the Book of Kells, the Great Book of Lecan, like, the Book of Ballymote, all of these, the Book of Lismore, quite recently returned to the Irish people. Thanks very much, English fuckers. In all of these things, there is kind of an entire area of academic study in this field called marginalia, which is stuff written in the margins, which is content crammed into the margins around the main stories or around the main text, around the main glossary, around the main list of Irish kingship, if we're talking about the historical cycle. It's literally, as it's being penned on these vast vellum sheets over ages of time, someone went out of their way to use the resources and the time and the effort and the energy, because it wasn't just roll a ballpoint pen and have your say or fire a couple of words into a comment section. It was like slavishly put forward in effort and energy upon these kind of vellum. And so if someone's going to write something into the margins of it and invest all that effort, it means they're really feeling about it, or there's really strong opinions about it. And that's where we find, these monks, these Irish monks, early Irish monks, kind of covering themselves. It's like they write down the story of the Cosmic Tour, for example, or the Tombo Chulia. And then in these sidelines, in the gaps between the actual story, they have the little comment section. They have this little kind of like, because demons, or because they're not really gods, or because whatever. But as much as we have these marginalia, that actually shows to a certain degree that the content in the main form was faithfully reproduced, because we know a lot of these books made in the Middle Ages, in like the early medieval period, 1100s, 1200s, 1400s, the content of which some of the older books we can linguistically trace to 800 and 900 Common Era. Like we know all of this stuff is ancient, and those books, when they fade over time, are faithfully reproduced and copied. So we get more copies of a copy. But again, it's not a case of I'll just slap it on a photocopier. It's like, I will give this tome to these 50 lads who will then take it apart page by page carefully, who will then copy that page by page and then put it back together over the next 10 years. This is an effort and an amazing kind of stuff to be doing. Sorry, I know I'm steering off the main content, but I'm trying to just phrase it in such a way that we don't know a lot of this content for 100% sure, but what we can say does come from these very particular reliable sources that we have. So, to bring it to the question, did the ancient Irish revere their ancestors? Hard to say for sure. Really hard to say for sure. Because, again, if there were practices in place from a formal point of view, they're lost to us. What we do have is, though, the cultural point of view and the more modern folklore as we look at these kind of things, and even down to the modern culture of Ireland and Irish people today. And this, I think, is where we can tease out maybe a perspective or an answer to this question. If we go back to the mythological cycle, we have the arrival of the Tuatha Dé Danann, for instance, coming into Ireland, and the Firbolg are actually here. The first interaction in that story in the mythological cycle is a hero, a champion of the Tuatha Dé Danann called Bress, not the same Bress as the guy who becomes king, a different Bress. Bress is then sent out because they see a warrior approaching from over the hills. And he goes out to meet him, and he goes out with, his spear in hand and his shield in front of him, and he meets this warrior on the other side of the hill who has javelins in hand and a shield in front of him. And before even words are spoken, they size each other up, they look at each other, and we get this lovely description of Bress seeing this other champion, this champion of the Firbolg called Shreng, and they describe each other by their likenesses. They're similar. And then when they do speak, they realize they speak the same language. They have a shared language between them. And then they begin to ask, who are you and what people are you from? And by going that back, by following that lineage in this ancient mythological tale, they realize that both tribes, the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Firbolg, are descended from the tribe of Nemid, who were in Ireland before them. And so it is the sons of Nemed who flee out of Ireland. Simeon takes his people off. They go in around Greece. They kind of populate there. They survive. They're oppressed there. Eventually, they come back into Ireland as the Fir Bullock, the Fir Donan. But the descendants of Buatach, the of son of Nemed, he went out into the north and east of the world, to the islands in the north and east of the world, and they became the Tuatha Dé Danann. So there is this recognition that they are of the same lineage, of the same tribe. So what the story tells us is that tribal lineage was important. It was something that was remembered, and it wasn't just down to like, yeah, you're from here or whatever. It was obviously significant enough that it's not just a case of, well, I am Jon O'Sullivan, I am John, son of Jack and Carmel O'Sullivan, Jack being son of Ned O'Sullivan, and this is where we then follow, as we move through the stories, we get into the lineages as we move down into the medieval era and the cycle of kings, which is the latest cycle of, well, the more okay, it is the cycle of ancient Irish history that is closest to our modern era, but still saying that it is hundreds of years old. But this cycle of kings, it lists out those who were kings in Ireland, but it also lists out why they were kings, who they were from, what tribe they were from. In some of the more famous instances, we have full lineages of individuals going right the way back, because it was important not just to know who you are and where you're from, but also who your parents were, who their parents were, who their parents were, because that then provided longevity. That then provided a recognition of not just who you are, but also your status within society. I mentioned the bards. When we have in the legal tracts that if there was ever a gathering of chieftains or kings, if there was ever a meeting or a challenge or a difficulty to be resolved in front of a brehon over a judgment, for example, the individuals who would come to that had to start by declaring who they are, who their ancestors are, who their ancestors were, and that's the job of the bard. The bard would, or the fella in the instance of like the higher society, they would have full lineages dating back generations and more that would be recited straight away before anything else could be done, before any conversation could be had, before any communication, before any conflict, before any judgment, before food and drink could be served. Everyone had to be known, everyone had to be declared for who they are and whose people they come from. And it's only then that their status could be recognized within society. So does this indicate to us that there was some form of reverential worship of ancestors? No. But it does indicate to us that the importance of your ancestry, the importance of your lineage, or not even down to your, like, we're not talking genetic lineage here. We're not talking your blood type, your hair color, your DNA. We're talking what peoples are you from? What tribe do you come from? Because at some point, as you begin to go further and further back, you're not tracing a bloodline anymore. You're tracing the history and heritage of a tribe in a certain landscape, because that's also what we're dealing with. Ancient Ireland was tribal, so much so that the status of the laws were such that people who existed within their tribal lands had privileges, have rights, had all of their, supports and structures and honor prices due to them in their own tribal area, in the land of their Tuatha. But if they are outside of the land of their Tuatha, they have zero rights, zero kind of privileges, and zero protections to a certain degree. But that does depend on their status. For every rule, there's a break. Because bards, for example, bards could travel Tuatha to Tuatha, and no one would fuck with a bard because they could, in some cases, demand the same honor price as a king or a chieftain of the tribal lands that they come from. So it wasn't just a function of who are you and where do you come from. It's a recognition of what land, what area of the island are you from? Like, what peoples do you come from? Because that then indicates, not just you as an individual, but also the collective, the landscape, how far afield you are. And, again, in rivalries, for example, because there was a lot of rivalries, whether or not someone is an ally, descendant of an ally, of tribal alliances or tribal enemies. So when we talk about ancestors, there's an importance in Irish society around ancestry. There's an importance in Irish society around recognition of who and where you come from, because that then gives more information about who you are today or in that moment. And it's not a case that we would revere ancestors as well. Okay, I do need to take another slight piece of information to add this in here. Older Irish tribal names going back in their lineage, going back in that generational record, can at some point, and it was a very, very common practice to do, trace their bloodline or lineage back to a member of the Tuatha Danann, for example. Some descendant of like divinity or gods or deities in that way. So when we're talking about the Irish pantheon, we're not just talking about like sky entities that came out of anywhere or were created in the creation of the universe. We're talking about a tribe of people descended from another tribe of people who lived in Ireland. And so from a certain perspective, all Irish deities are in some way ancestor deities. One of the older kind of Irish tribes, the Oganacht, coming from the Munster area, the Munster kind of southern section of Ireland, trace the lineage back to the Dagda, for example. And then you follow my lineage, O'Sullivan's, you go right back down. We're from Munster. Like there's a very, very famous kind of march of O'Sullivan's, which is recorded in the Irish histories out of the Bear Peninsula. And in fact, there was a schism in the ancient O'Sullivan lineage, should we say. The tribe was split between O'Sullivan Moor, Big O'Sullivan, and O'Sullivan Bear, named for the Bear Peninsula, which is literally the name of the land in that area still to this day. So speaking of this day, and I teased it at the top end, moving it into the more modern context, I don't think that this cultural "who are you" is lost to us. When we're talking about the ancient Irish society, we do have to look at how the roots of that still maintain, still down to today. Like a lot of people may not understand or fully kind of conceptualize how small the island of Ireland is. In a car, you can drive from the east to the west, the furthest points east to west, 2 hours, 3 hours. 3 hours if you're going, like, if you manage to, like, if you have to go off motorways. Top to bottom, you're talking 6 to 7 hours, and that's maybe Mallinhead to Mizenhead, right? Again, depending on how much motorway you can get. So it is not a huge landmass. And at one point, we know that there was over 180 different tribal kingdoms in Ireland. So the idea of who are you and where do you come from is very important. Now, if I bring in the concept that is widely known around the world of 6 degrees of separation, that take any person at all, any two people, and begin to kind of trace their crossovers, where did they come from, where they lived in the world, where did they go to school, where, whatever. And as you begin to kind of chase that back, you'll get like 6 steps predominantly between these individuals at some point. So like it's an interesting thing to do. It doesn't apply in all circumstances, but the reason I bring that up is in Ireland, we don't get as far as 6 steps of separation. There is no 6 degrees of separation. You're probably down to about 3, maybe 4, if you're at top and bottom of the island, which is both fascinating but also frustrating. We get people as like, oh yeah, do you know X person, like, living in, and then like, just because Ireland's small, it doesn't mean we all know each other. But when we begin to do that interrogation or question or query, I grew up in Dublin. Like, I grew up in a place of Dublin called Finglas. That is in the north of city Dublin, which is in the north of County Dublin as a suburb. Like suddenly you go to my parents who, Cabra, suburb of Dublin, and Ballyfermot, suburb of another further afield suburb of Dublin. And as we begin to kind of chase that around, you realize that there are more closer connections. Myself and my beloved Laura, for example, we met when I was in my late 20s, maybe even pushing 30. But it turns out that, we grew up less than 20 minutes away from each other by car. These things are like both fascinating and frustrating when there is a presumption placed upon it. But again, it's a presumption for a reason. But the thing you will find if you visit Ireland and get talking to people is you will be asked, oh, sure, where are you from? Or who are you and where do you come from? That to this day still happens. And it's not about who the fuck are you and who do you think you are to be here. it's a curious inquisition about, like, are you from the area? Do you know people of this area? And that has still carried out generations later across all of the world through the diaspora, because so many people out there, descendant of Irish people, still look to where their parents came from, still look to where their grandparents came from or their great-grandparents came from. So as much as we can't say that there was a reverence of ancestors in ancient Irish culture, we can't deny the fact that who you are and where you come from has become such a very big cultural importance to anyone of Ireland, but also of Irish descent, which is the same for those who come into Ireland in a way. It's not, again, you have no right to be here in Ireland. The story of Ireland is emigration and immigration. Like the oppressed sons of Nemad got the fuck out of Ireland and became the Firbolg and became the Tuatha Dé Danann, and then came back into Ireland. They were entitled to come into Ireland. They were welcomed into Ireland. There was conflict about it, a couple of scraps and slaps. Again, I'm summarizing terribly, but then there was accommodations and cohabiting circumstances that were resolved across the board. And anyone who says that, Ireland is full, Ireland should not welcome immigrants, they can get fucked. They are not Irish, because the story of Ireland is emigration and immigration. Our people have gone out all across the world, and our people come back all from the world with still having a love of Ireland. And, this feeling about, like, who are you and where are you from? So I know I have gone multiple which ways tangentially with this kind of question, because, as I said, it's a fascinating one to explore from this perspective. We can't say that there was ancestor worship. There might have been, we could have lost information because of, like, as I've said, oppression and, the eradication of ancient Irish identity in many ways, shape, or forms. But when we look at these cultural habits, cultural, like, folklore stories, the information that still exists down to this very day. Like, I'm Jon O'Sullivan of Dublin, Ireland, of Finglas. Like, I know where I grew up, but people do ask, oh, well, who are you and where are you from? And, oh, yeah, I'm out of Dublin. Oh, whereabouts in Dublin? Oh, yeah, well, north side of Dublin. I was, like, in Blanche. Oh, yeah, well, well, actually I grew up in Finglas. Oh, really? Yeah, do you know X number of person who grew up off Wellmount Road? And I was like, I used to cycle my bike down Wellmount Road. That is literally a conversation I've actually had with someone I met in the back of Beyond down in Cork. Like, these things happen, and it is about, in a way, knowing where you're from, in some way defining who you are, and allowing the fact that if you change locations, go to different places, those too inform who you are. I'm no longer Jon O'Sullivan of Dublin. I'm Jon O'Sullivan of Waterford. I grew up in Dublin, but I am in Waterford for nearly a quarter of my life at this particular point. That doesn't mean I'm no longer from where I was. That's just extra information which enriches and fulfills who I am now. And the same applies as to whether I came from a different country or not. So I hope I have answered that question. Maybe I have stimulated a whole rake of additional questions. If I have, please feel free to pop down into the comments and let me know. If there is someone of Japanese culture who comes across this video and has an opinion to actually share in regards to ancestor reverence, I'd be fascinated to hear it. And yeah, I look forward to kind of sharing more and more of this as we go and grow. Don't forget, pop down into the description as well, pick up the link to the free resources, dive onto our mailing list. Whenever we do these kind of video resources and all the rest of it, we give emails to let you know what's going on with us and how to connect more and more with us at the Irish Pagan School. Now, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to have to go and finish my coffee in a broken mug, or maybe transfer it to a safe mug. But I will finish off by saying, Gaurav Mahagas, thank you very, very much for being here. Look after yourself, take care, and until the next time, slán. Goodbye.